Welcome everyone to this session on preparing students for Japanese HSC speaking examinations. We recognize the ongoing custodians of the lands and waterways where we work and live. We pay respect to elders, past and present, as ongoing teachers of knowledge, songlines, and stories. We strive to ensure every Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander learner in New South Wales achieves their potential through education. Today, we are presenting from Darawal. The artwork you see on the screen is Reflections, created by Zara Marulanda from Blaxland High School as part of the 2021 Schools Reconciliation Challenge. My name is Frank Xia, and I am here today with my colleague Miyako Shida. If you haven't met us before, we are both language officers at the Tanken Center. In addition to hosting excursions at the Tanken Center, we provide various support, including a teacher assistance line, a variety of learning packages and videos that you can access online, and speaking practice sessions for senior students. Running these practice sessions is important, as it provides students with the knowledge and skills to improve their speaking skills. In addition, sometimes, when we meet with students, it is their first opportunity to speak with a native speaker or the first opportunity to speak with someone other than their classroom teacher. It is through running speaking sessions for over 10 years that we have learned so much about preparing students for speaking examinations, as well as the common mistakes students make and identifying areas for improvement. We hope you find our session today both practical and useful, and it helps you with preparing your students for the speaking examinations. Firstly, if you are not familiar with the HSC oral examinations, both the continuous and beginners oral examinations are worth 20 marks. The continuous examination goes for approximately 10 minutes, and the beginner's examination goes for approximately 5 minutes. Both examinations consist of a conversation between the student and the examiner. Naturally, having a conversation with an examiner and the conversation being recorded are nerve-wracking for all students, so ensuring that they are well prepared is essential. These are the continuous marking guidelines taken from the NESA website. Take a moment to read the marking guidelines and consider the highlighted words. The key words are engages effectively, depth, intonation, accuracy, excellent knowledge of vocabulary, and language structures. We hope that you will get a better understanding of these from our presentation today. The first point is, engages effectively and fluently in a conversation by responding in some depth to a range of questions. Engaging effectively in a conversation means not just answering the question, but thinking what more the questioner would want to know regarding the topic. The example I usually give is about answering the question, 好きな音楽は何ですか? If the student answers, いろいろな音楽です, it sounds like the student doesn't want to talk to me, and is an example of the student not engaging effectively in the conversation. We will unpack depth further later in this presentation. The second point is, uses consistently appropriate language features to enhance communication, such as intonation. To ensure students' intonation is perfect, I suggest that students are encouraged to learn hiragana instead of using romaji when they start learning Japanese. Even when students write romaji on top of hiragana to show them how to read the characters, students often end up talking like they are reading the Japanese alphabet. For example, there is a big difference between konnichiwa and konnichiwa. We have found that students who like watching Japanese anime or movies tend to do well in speaking and listening. These students have better intonation and have also learnt how to use fillers like eto and ano to make the answer sound more natural. So I encourage students to regularly watch anime or movies in Japanese with English subtitles. The third point focuses on accuracy. Accuracy is essential, so encourage your students to revise vocabulary and language structures. Language structures that align with topics will be unpacked later in this presentation. Learning language structures that align well with topics enhances accuracy. And finally, the last point is demonstrates an excellent knowledge of vocabulary and language structures. The continuous speaking exam is only 10 minutes, so it is best to use as many language structures as possible. And if your students know how to use sophisticated vocabulary, encourage them to use these. And here are the marking guidelines for beginners. Again, take a moment to read through and note the highlighted words. The key words are converses effectively, relevant information, opinions and comment, intonation, excellent control, variety of vocabulary, and language structures. Whilst the continuous and beginners courses are different and have different lengths for their speaking examinations, there are similarities in the marking guidelines. So although we will be giving you advice that is applicable to students in the beginners or continuous course, you can see there is a crossover in the marking criteria and expectations of the two courses. Let's look at depth, which is in the continuous marking guidelines. Take a moment to think about how depth in conversation is achieved. Many students struggle giving depth. First, when they hear that they need to provide depth, many of them don't know what depth in a conversation is. Giving depth means giving reasons, adding personal stories to the answer, or including different perspectives. For example, I want to become a teacher, but my mum wants me to be a doctor. Providing context or background information. For example, my mum wants me to be a doctor, so I study biology. Or, I've never been to Japan, so I would like to save money and go to Japan after the HSC. And adding students' comments, opinions, or feelings. For example, I like reading books, but I don't like reading Shakespeare's books, as I think the themes are too difficult to understand. When asking students to give depth, we suggest using these structures. Take a moment to read through the structures. These are the structures we recommend for beginners. Take a moment to read through the structures. Whilst giving depth is not required for beginner students, by using these language structures, students can include their opinions and comments, demonstrating a variety of language structures which they are required to do. Unlike the listening, reading, and writing components of the examination, in speaking, questions are generated on the spot by the examiner. Each student will be asked different questions. However, students may get a similar set of questions to other students completing the course in the same year or students from previous years. As a result, preparation is very important for the students. In fact, students who have prepared thoroughly are more confident and seem to be more relaxed and ready for the exam. Having a good understanding of language structures through thorough preparation is crucial for the fourth point of the continuous marking guidelines, demonstrates an excellent knowledge of vocabulary and language structures, and the third point for the beginners, variety of vocabulary and language structures. At the Tanken Center speaking workshops, we sometimes come across students who are confident in their language skills and don't think they need to prepare. But their lack of preparation becomes evident, and these students don't do as well as hoped. Both the Japanese continuous syllabus and the Japanese beginner's syllabus have comprehensive lists of the language structures. Students should be familiar with the syllabus and should have a comprehensive understanding of how to use the language structures listed in the syllabus. When you look carefully at the syllabus, specific language structures or vocabulary go well with specific topics or questions. And here are some examples. なければなりません is the longest conjugation in both the continuous and beginners courses, but is recognition only for beginner students. If beginner students can use the structure, then they should. It is perfect for the topic of future plans or school life. For example, after saying, I want to become a doctor, but I don't like science, students could add, もっと勉強しなければなりません. Or, after saying, I want to become a professional soccer player, they could add, もっと練習しなければなりません. Or even, もっと練習しなければならないとコーチが言いました. Similar to なければなりません is た方がいいです. They are almost interchangeable, as although they mean different things, the difference is small. It is the difference between better to do or must do. This means if a student has already used なければなりません, we suggest the student uses た方がいいです next time. てはダメです and てもいいです are pairs of structures like the previous two structures, but in this case, they have the opposite meaning. They mean can do and can't do. They obviously go well with rules, so students can mention what they can do or can't do. School rules, or house rules, are excellent topics to use these structures in. てみます can easily be changed to make てみたいです, and both are useful for the topics of future plans, leisure, and recreation. Many of these language structures can be combined to make more complex sentences, and whether these sentences are used in the original base form, negative form, or plain form, using them accurately and appropriately aligns to excellent control or grammatical accuracy in marking guidelines. Many of the language structures in this slide are for continuers, but considering there is an increasing number of combined classes these days, we hope this slide will also benefit beginner students. For continuous students, 予定です and おうと思います are interchangeable with tsumori desu. We suggest students try to avoid using tai desu, specifically for future plans, because they can use tai desu in many different situations. But tsumori desu, yotei desu, and o to omoimasu specifically refer to the future. From our experience, most students who aren't prepared are unable to use a comparison sentence during speaking practice sessions. If they can't do it during practice, there is a high chance they won't be able to do it during the HSC examination. Students should learn how to use at least one good sentence with comparisons, such as when talking about school subjects. For example, 数学より科学の方が簡単だと思います。When talking about food, for example, ピザよりパスタの方が好きです。Or when talking about sports, for example, サッカーよりバスケットボールの方が得意です。Many students struggle with あげます、くれます, and もらいます. In English, くれます and もらいます both mean someone gives me. あげます、くれます and もらいます appear in many of the textbooks teachers use when teaching beginner students. So hopefully beginner students can understand and use these too. Let's take a closer look at くれます and もらいます。母がプレゼントをくれました。and 私が母にプレゼントをもらいました。Both mean my mum gave me the present. When the focus is on mum giving me the present, students should use particle が and say 母がプレゼントをくれました。When the subject is myself receiving the present, students should use particle に and say 母にプレゼントをもらいました。And of course, in Japanese, we can omit 私が at the beginning of the sentence. It's the same when people are doing me a favor by saying てくれます。For example, 母が朝ごはんを作ってくれます。Students can combine くれます and もらいます with other structures too. For example, もっと漢字の練習をした方がいいと先生が言ってくれました。If a student struggles with these language structures, we suggest that students learn a sentence about something they received for their birthday. For example, if they received the book, they can say 本をもらいました。A language structure that many students struggle with is relative clauses. They are complicated and rather mathematical in a way. Unlike relative clauses in English, where they come after relative pronouns, such as that, which, who, and where, Japanese relative clauses always come before the noun it relates to. Relative clauses are hard to understand, and sometimes the explanations only confuse students more. Quite often, students understand them when they see the examples, I bought a book yesterday, and the book I bought yesterday is interesting. where underlined sections explicitly show the relative clause. In Japanese, these sentences are 昨日本を買いました。昨日買った本は面白いです。If students are having difficulty understanding relative clauses, we suggest students prepare sentences in English and translate them, and have students memorize whole sentences for examination purposes. For example, ピザやパスタなどイタリア料理が好きですが、母が作ってくれる料理が一番おいしいと思います。If a student remembers this sentence, the student can use this to answer most food-related questions. For example, what food do you like? I like Italian food, but I think the food that my mom cooks is the best. Or, do you like Japanese food? Yes, I love sushi and ramen, but I think the food that my mom cooks is the best. Or, what restaurants do you like to go to? I like to go to Chinese restaurants, but I think the food that my mom cooks is the best. By including a relative clause in the response, students are demonstrating that they can use one of the most complicated language structures in the course. Let's now focus on vocabulary. You may remember the marking criteria for both continuers and beginners mention vocabulary. An excellent knowledge of vocabulary or a variety of vocabulary. Personally, when I hear the word vocabulary, the first thing I think of is a noun. But vocabulary is more than that. Think back to your own experiences in language learning. It takes quite an effort to build up your knowledge of vocabulary. Just like learning 300 kanji in the continuous course can't be achieved overnight, learning vocabulary takes time and commitment. Students need to build their vocabulary knowledge little by little. One area that students tend to use less when speaking are time-related expressions. Getting students to build their vocabulary in this area helps to make their sentences more interesting. We have created a list of time-related expressions, so please share these with your students and encourage them to use them in their sentences. If students are asked, 朝何時頃起きますか? A good response would be, いつも夜遅くまで勉強しているので、大抵8時頃に起きます。でも、時々7時くらいに起きて、朝ごはんの前にジョギングに行きます。Particles like まで、から、くらい、頃、だけ can also be added to sentences and used like adverbs. Another technique to build student vocabulary is to encourage them to know and use conjunctions and other linking words. These features enhance communication by giving flow to answers and making them sound more fluent. だから and それで can be used for so. しかし、でも、だけど and が can be used for but. しかも、それに and さらに can be used for moreover. それとも can be used for or. なぜなら and ので can be used for because. ところで can be used for by the way. 例えば can be used for example. そして can be used for and. It is important that students are familiar with conjunctions and other linking words. I will now hand over to Mieko to continue.
Let's look at tips for speaking examinations. Most students are probably already familiar with these tips, but please reinforce these as knowing and following them are two separate things. The tips come from the mistakes we hear in the practice speaking sessions. 自分の名前、学校の名前は言わない。It's the rule of the HSC not to say your name nor school name. Surprisingly, some students we talk to during our speaking sessions do not know about this. 質問をよく聞く。It is important to listen well. One of the common questions students are asked is, 学校はどんな学校ですか? This question is not asking which school they are attending. It is asking, what kind of school is it? So, students need to describe their school. Another example is, あなたの友達はどんな人ですか? Students often answer with their friend's name. For example, 私の友達はリサです. When they should be describing their friend. A way to get students to listen more carefully to the question is to play speaking games in the classroom, where if students make mistakes, they lose points. I often played quiz show type games when I was teaching at a boys' school. As the students were very competitive, they were very conscious about making these kind of errors, and their speaking improved. Students need to be reminded to listen to the examiner's questions very carefully. Students often assume the meaning of the question from only some of the words they hear. For example, when asked, 学校の昼休みに何をしますか? Students just focus on the word 休み and will reply with something like 学校の休みに家族とメルボルンに行きます。テンスに気をつける。Tense is also important. There is a big difference between 朝ごはんに何を食べますか and 朝ごはんに何を食べましたか? Students need to be reminded to focus on listening out for the tense of the question the examiner asks. 一つの質問に三つの文を準備する。We believe that the best approach is to prepare 3 lines answers for each question. 1. Answer the question. 2. Expand the answer. 3. Add the comment and opinion. It is important to avoid simple, short one-line answers and be mindful that the exam time goes super fast. Also, by giving 3-line responses, it reduces the time the examiner has to ask questions, thus ensuring the examiner can't ask too many questions, which takes up time, giving the students more time to showcase their skills. For follow-up questions, it is not necessary to give 3-line answers. For example, ご家族は何人ですか? 家族は3人で、父と母と私です。私たちはとても仲がいいです。よく両親と一緒にレストランに行って美味しい和食を食べます。一番好きな和食は何ですか？ This question is a follow-up question, so a one-line response is okay. 和食の中では唐揚げが一番好きで、よく母が作ってくれます。Of course, if students are capable, they can continue. Please note that although we recommend continuous and beginner students prepare three-line answers, there is no guarantee that the examiner will always let students finish three-line answers. The examiner may jump in after the second line, so it is important for your students to prepare their answers with good structures and sophisticated vocabulary from the very first line to show off their skills. 大きな声ではっきりと話す。Please remind your students that it is extremely important to speak in a loud voice, especially for students who are softly spoken. Impression is important, and having a loud voice helps to sound confident, which leaves a better impression. リピートはもう一度お願いします。Make sure your students know the expression もう一度お願いします。Quite often, students say this line incorrectly as もう一度ください。Students are confused with もう一度言ってください。So, it is better for them to use もう一度お願いします。自分の間違いに気がついたら言い直す。Make sure your students know that they need to correct themselves if they realize that they have made a mistake. This way, the marker knows that students know the correct expression. Very often, students say, I knew I made a mistake, but the examiner moved to the next question, so I left it as it is. Please tell students that this is their time to demonstrate their skills, and it is okay for them to correct themselves if they make a mistake. 英語を使わない。Please remind students not to use English. Encourage this with students from the beginning. Often students will say sorry during their speaking, so try to get students to stop this habit. We have been running HSC holiday workshops for many years and have conducted face-to-face and online speaking sessions with over 1,000 students. Mistakes students make during speaking examinations don't change much. Let's look at some common errors. If your students tend to make these common errors, please think of how you can help them to improve. もう一度ください。As mentioned earlier, students usually forget 言って。So, to avoid confusion, when teaching students how to say please repeat it, teach もう一度お願いします。私の姉はきれいと頭がいいです。Joining adjectives is the number one mistake students make. い and na adjectives are confusing for students, especially with words like 綺麗な. So play simple adjective games which help students reinforce their understanding of these. なぜならからです. Keep practicing until students can use this structure with ease. Again, play simple games repeatedly to help them to memorize the correct usage. 毎日3時くらい勉強します. This sentence is missing the period of time and needs 間. I suggest you ask a lot of questions that students need to use 間 in for student to get this right. 私は日本語の料理を作ります. Mixing up the use of 日本, 日本人 and 日本語 is a very common error. Students need to be reminded repeatedly that 語 means it's a language. 先生は優しいと親切と思います. This response has two errors. There is the adjective issue and that has been left out from in front of と思います. Reinforce this every time a student makes a mistake to help them remember how to use this structure correctly. 私の母はあまりスポーツをします。あまり needs to be used with the verb in the negative form. We find that often students don't know this simple rule. 僕の趣味はピアノを弾きます。Students need to be reminded not to make this error. When referring to 趣味, students cannot end sentence with a verb. Students should use ことです instead, if not using a noun. The correct answer to the question is 僕の趣味はピアノを弾くことです。In this section of common errors, we have included the questions. Often when students are asked, あなたのお誕生日はいつですか? They respond with, 私のお誕生日は11月1日です。Students need to be aware that honorific or cannot be used for themselves. Even knowing this, when question contains honorifics, students often tend to repeat what the examiner said. Often when students are asked, あなたの町はどんな町ですか? They respond with, 私の町は賑やかくて便利なです。This is a case of a mistake with the adjective. Although good vocabulary choices have been made, if they are not used correctly, it doesn't mean anything. Often when students are asked, 朝ごはんに何を食べますか? They respond with, トーストを食べました。Tense is an issue that students need to be mindful about. They need to listen to the whole question to the end and stop assuming that they know the question until they hear the entire question. The most important part in a Japanese sentence comes at the end, including modality, positive or negative, and tense. And in many questions, students can just take off the か at the end and use the question asked to create their answer. Often when students are asked, いつから日本語を勉強していますか? They respond with, 僕は7年生の時に日本語の勉強を始まりました。This is a common issue with transitive and intransitive verbs. It is not easy, but if your student is wanting to include this line in their answer, please make sure that they are responding correctly. Quite often, students don't know where they are making mistakes with this grammatical point. I hope that you feel relieved that your students are not the only one keep making these errors. They are extremely common errors. And finally, we want to share common errors that we hear from advanced level students. Firstly, 私の母は私に一生懸命勉強しなければなりません。そして、いい大学に入ってください。と言っています。Students are advised to use polite forms. However, in this case, it sounds unnatural to quote the family members with a polite expression. This is a rare chance that students can demonstrate their ability to use the plain form. In 大学で何を勉強するかまだ知らないけど日本に留学したいです。The use of the word 知らない needs to be taught. It sounds inappropriate and could be rude, depending on the question the examiner has asked. ディズニーシー行ったことないです is an example where students need to be reminded that it is an examination and they are not talking to their relatives in Japan. So they need to use proper sentences with correct particles. Quite often, students with advanced level Japanese skill Japanese skip particles or use incorrect ones. ばあちゃんが日本に住んでいます is an example that shows students often use the wrong vocabulary when referring to their own family members as opposed to people from outside the family. With サッカーの後で僕の足が痛くなります。Students often think there is nothing wrong this sentence. In Japanese, it is unnatural to say 僕の in this sentence, as it is obvious the pain in the leg is the speaker's pain. With 母はプレゼントをもらって嬉しかったです。The feelings of others cannot be expressed in this way, and the sentence cannot be translated. In this case, students should use 嬉しそうでした。These final two examples of common errors are answers that advanced level students give. The problem with these are they are too long. These sentences 誕生日は2月1日で、今年は家族と和食のレストランに行って、たくさん美味しいお寿司を食べて、その後カラオケに行って、母と一緒に日本語の歌を歌って、それから家に帰ってプレゼントに新しいカバンとお金をもらいました。And 学校の規則はあまり厳しくないけど、携帯を使えないのはとても不便だと思っていて、前はどこの教室に行けばいいかわからないとき、携帯で友達に聞けたけど、今はできないから大変でちょっと良くないと考えます。are best divided into 2 or 3 lines, which will make them much better answers. While we suggest students avoid simple sentences, long-winded sentences are not good either. Also, if students speak like this, they tend to write like this, so it is very important to remind them to avoid making their answers unnecessarily long. What are strategies to help students who are nervous? What advice do you give to students who are nervous? Here are some strategies to help students who are nervous. Accept nervousness as normal. Explain to students that even the examiner gets nervous. It's part of the process. It's okay if their hands are shaking. The markers cannot see them. You need to keep telling students it is fine to be nervous. Help students to master useful filler phrases. Learn phrases like そうですね and と sound natural and by time. Make sure students practice under real examination conditions. Simulate the test environment with timers, recordings, and unfamiliar teachers. In class, you can put 3 students together to practice. One becomes the examiner, one becomes the student, and the third person becomes an observer to give feedback. The purpose of this is to put students under pressure. If they practice a lot, they become more confident, and an extra bonus is that students get to know each other in class and build good working relationships. Remind students that they need to use clear structures. This means 1. Answer the question. 2. Expand the answer. 3. Add their comments and opinions. Get students to try calming techniques before speaking. Use deep breathing techniques to calm nerves. I once heard that if you look for a clock as soon as you enter the examination room, it helps to calm you down by changing your focus. Find a simple technique that works for your students. Give strength-based feedback. Highlight what went well before suggesting improvement. I'm sure that your students are comfortable talking to you and appreciate timely feedback. That will certainly help students to become more confident and hopefully less nervous. Encourage students to aim to communicate and deal with whatever question they are asked on the spot. Encourage flexible speaking even when the vocabulary is forgotten. Students panic when they forget their memorized lines. We know that they can deal with the question even they forget their lines. Make sure your students know it is normal to have a mind blank and forget some lines during the examination, but they can still reply. Tell them to say もう一度お願いします to buy time and create their answer on the spot. Make sure that your students know that it is perfectly okay to say responses completely different from what they were going to say. The most important thing is to answer the question and move on, rather than wasting time trying to recall memorized lines. Thank you so much for your time engaging with presentation. I hope you can take some ideas back to your classroom and help students improve their speaking. Remember, if you have any questions or are after advice, please contact us via email. Our email address can be found on the screen. ありがとうございました。